Well, welcome everybody. My name is George Laws Garcia. I'm the executive director of the Puerto Rico Statehood Council, the organization that runs PR 51st. And we're very happy to have all of you participating in this virtual town hall event tonight. We have two distinguished guests that are going to be participating in this conversation about the economics of statehood. And right now, obviously, we have the November 3rd statehood yes or no vote happening in Puerto Rico, which is the first time in 122 years that the US citizens of Puerto Rico have ever been asked the question about whether or not they favor Puerto Rico's admission as a state with a simple yes or no question. Now, at the national level, Puerto Rico has never received as much attention in this issue as it is now. And evidence of that is the fact that we've had comments on this by both current presidential candidates on both sides of the aisle, former presidents, and Senate Majority and Minority Leader, and countless others. Obviously, it is a critical moment for the United States. And while a lot of the conversation about Puerto Rico's statehood has focused on the potential political implications of statehood for Puerto Rico, we believe that there's an equally important conversation to have about the economic impacts of statehood for not just the people on the island, but everyone mainland as well. And to help us address these questions, we've actually brought two economists that are going to be joining us today. And the first person that we're going to introduce is Mr. Mike Fellman. Mike Fellman is a professional economist with a diverse financial sector experience, including working at the leading global multilateral financial institution, the International Monetary Fund. Fellman also has experience in domestic economic issues, having worked for Freddie Mac, which is a public government-sponsored enterprise that's in the Fortune 500 list of largest U.S. corporations by total revenue. He's originally from Minneapolis, Minnesota. He's a graduate of the University of Minnesota and holds a master's degree in economics from the University of Maryland. Fellman is also a national chess master and a professional chess coach. He is obviously from mainland United States, but he's actually Puerto Rican by choice because he currently resides with his wife in Bayamón, Puerto Rico. So you may hear some cookies in the background. All right, and our next distinguished guest on this town hall is Professor Arthur MacEwan. He has taught at the University of Massachusetts, Boston from 1975 to 2008 and is now Professor Emeritus in the Department of Economics. His courses have ranged on topics including economic development, macroeconomics, economics of education, Latin American economic history. He's the author of multiple books on topics ranging from U.S. financial crisis during the Great Recession to issues of international development. During the 2001 to 2002, Professor MacEwan was the university's interim provost and vice chancellor for academic affairs. He's also served on 3 separate terms as the chairperson for the Department of Economics. After his retirement from teaching, Professor MacEwan has continued to work at UMass Boston as a senior research fellow and then interim director at the Center for Social Policy and as interim director of the Labor Resource Center and Labor Studies program. He holds a PhD in economics from Harvard University, and most relevant to our conversation, has actually done a significant amount of research on the topic of the economic impact of Puerto Rico's current territory status and the possible economic impact of statehood on Puerto Rico. So welcome, Mike, welcome, Arthur. And I'd like to start out providing you with the opportunity to provide some opening remarks, and then we can move on to some moderated questions. And towards the latter half, we'd like to open it up from some questions from the audience. So Mike, take it away.
Hi, thanks George for putting this on. Arthur, thanks for being my partner here. So I'd like to start off by saying that while this is a forum about economics and economic issues, we don't operate in a vacuum. And so, human rights and self-determination is always present. And while we're going to be discussing economic issues, obviously, whenever you talk about, regarding the status, anytime the status of Puerto Rico comes up, the issues around self-determination and human rights are always operative. And so I just want to make it clear that my personal position is, so no one can question or say, you can put my remarks in a context that if Puerto Rico votes for statehood, it should be admitted as a state. And if it votes for independence, it should be granted independence. Okay. Punto, ya. All right. So anyway, with that in mind, I'd like to move on to my main remarks of the economic issues of what would happen if Puerto Rico were to be theoretically admitted as a state. So I really see the problems of the economy in Puerto Rico as just a kind of a chronic shortage of what economists call aggregate demand. There's just not enough spending power in the economy to really put everyone to work who wants to work, to support new businesses opening. And the cause of the initial cause of that was the loss, in my view, of special tax treatment for manufacturers abruptly, or somewhat of, so it was phased in, but somewhat you can kind of see as the drop dead date in 2006 started to approach, economic activity started to stagnate, and really ever since 2006. There's kind of been a 15-year depression on the island. And so normally what an economy will do to get out of those kinds of doldrums is, engage in large amounts of fiscal stimulus and deficit spending. But the problem for Puerto Rico is that is not an option on the table because, the government is bankrupt. And so Puerto Rico is caught in this kind of vicious cycle of not enough aggregate demand, no way to create that demand by itself. And statehood would bring billions of dollars in federal spending to the island in the form of fully funding a Medicaid program, social SSI spending, which is a Social Security supplemental income, enhanced SNAP benefits, and most importantly, in my view, the earned income tax credit, which is a very, very, very important social benefit to subsidize the wages of low-income workers and really raise their after-tax incomes by up to 20%, which is huge, for someone making, say, $20,000 a year. And to put it in context, the median income for a family here in Puerto Rico is only about $20,000. And so, given the reality of those, what would happen with those fiscal transfers and the economic stimulus it would provide quickly, immediately, and directly to families on the island, I feel that statehood, no matter what your views on the cultural issues, really, deserves to be discussed and debated. I guess I want to make a quick remark of, there's kind of what would happen, how could Puerto Rico potentially develop were it to be granted independence? Well, I would assume that would mean that U.S. fiscal transfers would stop. So rather than increasing as they would under statehood, they would probably be phased out or abruptly stop, go to zero. And so Puerto Rico would be in a situation where it would have to entirely restructure its economy towards exports to replace that money which is coming in every year from the federal government. And the problem is that the policies to promote exports, which would be introducing a new currency and allowing it to depreciate, keeping a lid on wages to maintain competitiveness, and moving towards a production rather than a service-based consumer economy are all things that, while possible, again, in a vacuum, would face significant political resistance, to say the least, and would take many decades to enact those kinds of reforms, if you could even maintain the political support. And so when you really look at it, in my view, again, as an economist, the benefits to statehood are immediate, guaranteed, and certain, and the potential benefits from pursuing a different path of economic development by shifting towards an export-based economy are uncertain politically, and uncertain even if they could be even if you could succeed politically. You still have to compete in the global marketplace, and that doesn't always go well. And distant. So immediate and certain versus distant and risky. And so for me as an economist, I like immediate and certain.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much for your opening remarks, Mike and Professor MacEwan.
Well, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to have the opportunity to talk about these issues. I'm not going to repeat what Mike said about the importance of the human rights issue at the foundation of the current status. While the Puerto Ricans are denied their right to self-determination, to full self-determination, I find this situation totally unacceptable. I'm not a Puerto Rican. I'm a citizen of the United States, though, and I find it humiliating that we continue to hold Puerto Rico in this position. But let me turn to the economic issues. And whatever change takes place, if there is a change in status in the future, it hasn't got much to compete with. The Puerto Rican economy has been doing badly for a long time, not simply since the current long-term recession began in around 2006. Let me share with you a graph that shows the growth of the US economy in the upper blue line and the growth of the Puerto Rican economy in the lower line since 1980, setting them both at an index of 100 in that year. First of all, the Puerto Rican economy experienced a worse recession at the beginning of the 1980s, slower as the US economy continued to expand, and then after about 2006. So it's not going to be too hard to beat this performance, whatever happens in the future. And I think that that's important to keep in mind. So let me take that off the screen. Now, the issue for me is, well, why is this? Why has the Puerto Rican economy done so badly? And I think it's a mistake to focus simply on what's happened since 2006. As the graph I put up shows, the problem started well before that. Now, I attribute these problems to the uncertainty and the dependence that is created by the current status. Uncertainty is always bad for long-term investment. It's also bad for the development of the basic infrastructure, whether it's social infrastructure such as education or physical infrastructure of the Puerto Rican economy. There is in Puerto Rico a short-termism, if you'll pardon the expression, that hinders the development of the economy. The dependence of the economy is in many ways seen in the government's policy of continually relying on favors from Washington. For example, Section 936 was a favor from Washington, and to look for businesses outside of Puerto Rico to provide the foundation for growth. This has meant the failure to take those steps which would build up a Puerto Rican-based business activity on the island. And without that, and without the foundations that go with a strong infrastructure, we can see the weakness of the economy. Now, also, as Mike mentioned, Puerto Rico is denied equal treatment in many programs. The Earned Income Tax Credit, the Child Tax Credit, Medicare, Medicaid, and the Nutritional Assistance Program. Just to give you an example, I punched in the numbers to TurboTax for last year, and a family earning $25,000 in Puerto Rico, and the exact same family, a couple with 2 children in the States, neither of them pays any federal income tax. Both pay Social Security and Medicare tax. But the family in the States gets the Earned Income Tax Credit and the Child Tax Credit and ends up with an income about $8,000 higher than the family in Puerto Rico. That's a huge difference. Now, a switch to state status would certainly change that particular thing. And it would bring in, if all these programs, if Puerto Rico were treated as the people in the states and state governments treated, would bring in several $billion each year. Somewhere, I made a very conservative estimate of about $6 billion a year. Of course, it would take time to move to that. Now, there are many people that think Puerto Rico is already treated very generously by the US government. Depends on how you look at it. One way to look at it is to calculate the net expenditures of the federal government by state and by territory. It turns out that on a per capita basis, the net expenditures, that is what the federal government spends compared to what the federal government takes in from a state or Puerto Rico. If you rank Puerto Rico, there are, in recent years, although the government stopped publishing the relevant data, but in several years, there were 16 or 17 states that got a better deal in terms of net expenditures, federal expenditures per capita than Puerto Rico. So it's hard to argue that Puerto Rico is treated in some generous manner. Now, how would the move to statehood bring about positive change? Well, first of all, it would bring in this money from equal treatment on these programs. It would eliminate the uncertainty that creates the short-termism that affects investment and policy. There'd be no more search for special favors from Washington, but with representatives in Congress, in the House and in the Senate, Puerto Rico would get a lot of treatment, much better than it has gotten in the second-class citizenship that the Puerto Ricans suffer under. And furthermore, while not every state builds its own economy without activity from other parts of the country, certainly the statehood would create a framework for overcoming the dependence that Puerto Rico has experienced. What would happen? What could happen? What could bring Puerto Rico out of the doldrums that has experienced? And I would suggest their major steps would be a focus on, with lots of funds, which I could argue how they're available if the right steps are taken, for the development of public infrastructure investment. There needs to be federal support, the way I've already mentioned. There needs to be a build-up and improvement of the whole educational system, top to bottom. There's some good, I don't mean that's all bad. It's not all bad. I'm certainly not condemning that, the education system, but there's tremendous room for improvement if it got the support that it needs. Changes have to be made in the regulatory system. The regulatory system has many things that need to be kept and are important, but it also has some things that need to be changed. It takes a tremendous long time to open a business in Puerto Rico, for example. There's a great deal of uncertainty. And finally, Puerto Rico has to do something about its tax collection. When I was working as a consultant at Hacienda, the story I heard was about an advertisement in the paper for somebody, a dentist, to join a dental office. And one of the good things about joining this dental office listed in the paper was, we get lots of cash payments. it was the key, of course, to avoiding taxes. Lots of steps have to be made to change that sort of attitude. Well, thank you very much. Let's go on from here.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you so much, Professor. I greatly appreciate it. And I'd like to start out with a couple of questions that we believe would be really helpful for the audience. We'll start out with this one. One of the challenges that we've seen during the past decades for Puerto Rico is a lack of consistency in our economic planning, right? And that means that whenever one political party switches or another one takes over, there's been a back and forth in terms of what the focus for economic development should be. And a lot of times that's also informed by the lack of certainty with regards to the status debate, because if you favor statehood, then certain economic policies would, optimize Puerto Rico's economic performance under that status, versus if you want to continue being a territory or become an independent country, other policies would be most appropriate. So my question is, can statehood for Puerto Rico help the island implement a long-term sustainable economic development strategy that expands opportunity, lessens inequality, and supports local entrepreneurship and wealth creation?
That's a yes or no question. No, of course not. I think there are things that could come with statehood that could do that. But let's remember that inequality is bad in Puerto Rico. It's worse than any state. But inequality has also been increasing in the United States for many years. So statehood would not separate Puerto Rico from that process in itself. However, if some of the steps that I've mentioned were undertaken, for example, the improvement and buildup of the educational system, that could certainly help. The education system for those at the bottom of the income ladder is especially weak. There's a high dropout rate in Puerto Rico. And with improvements on something like that, you could get both. You could get both greater equality and economic growth. I mean, one of the problems in Puerto Rico has been this blind, if you will, focus on manufacturing. Manufacturing has not led to great job creation in Puerto Rico. Needs to be able, the island needs to broaden under statehood or under any other system, broaden its economic base. And one way to do that, of course, is to build up the labor force by a great improvement in the educational system. For one thing that often gets mentioned is the opportunities for Puerto Rico to act as a bridge between the United States and Latin America on business services. Well, it's not going to replace Houston and Atlanta and Miami, but it certainly could play a bigger role than it has been in that regard. But that requires a more highly educated labor force. And so if statehood would provide the resources and the pressure for that to take place, it could be very helpful.
Excellent. Mike, any thoughts on that?
So I would add, in terms of certainty, and I would to go back to the idea of favors from Washington. One kind of unknown favor from Washington that Puerto Rico has is that there is an excise tax on rum imported into the United States that is given that tax and somewhat, is given to Puerto Rico. The collections from that tax is given to Puerto Rico every year. And, also, Section 969 and all these kind of patchwork systems to say, like, yeah, you kind of get, we're giving you very unequal treatment on, really effective programs like earned income tax credit that would, as Arthur said, could potentially increase, a family making $25,000 with a child, increase their income by, $8,000 a year. But, hey, here's a couple $100 million in rum excise taxes, and, here's Section 969, even though who knows who that benefits more, the underlying people who gain the employment from the firms that set up shop here, or actually the firms receiving the tax break. And so I think one of the great things Statehood could do is it could say, hey, here's a permanent, stable framework with which, here's where we're going to fund local, services on the island, in terms of health and education. And because there's formulas that exist in all the major legislation that created these kinds of programs like SNAP, that determine how much states get. And again, Puerto Rico gets less every year, and also that funding level has to be negotiated on a continuing basis, and that creates uncertainty. And so I would certainly echo that rather than when you talk about certainty and breathing space for a government to even pursue a long-term development strategy, well, if your Medicaid program could go poof if Washington doesn't come through with the funding, the right funding at the 11th hour, it's really hard to focus on making long-term investments in the island. I would add that I think that in the United States mainland, education itself is a major economic, not the human capital created by people obtaining skills at universities, but the universities themselves are major economic engines, because students, attend those schools and they, pay tuition and, purchase housing, purchase goods and services in the community, and students come from all over the world to study. And certainly, Puerto Rico with Spanish-speaking universities which would have U.S. accreditation could be an incredibly attractive place for students all over Latin America to study and to get a U.S. degree in their native language. And so I certainly would agree with Arthur in that regard, that being a bridge between Latin America and the U.S. and on an educational front is a humongous economic opportunity for the island.
Excellent. No, those are great insights. A lot of our audience is from Puerto Rico, but we also have a very significant audience that are both Puerto Rican stateside as well as other stateside individuals that are interested in the topic of statehood for Puerto Rico. So one thing that would be also really helpful to know is, what would the economic impact in terms of jobs and profits for stateside companies be potentially from Puerto Rico's admission as a state?
Tons of businesses here do operate on the island. Walmart, all the fast food chains, all kinds of consumer businesses. And so as Arthur said, if incomes are rising, by 20-30% because of changes in tax treatment, and people have more money in their pocket, they're going to go out and spend it. And lots of that spending is going to show up in, help the bottom lines of all kinds of companies doing business on the island.
I mean, what's good for Puerto Rico is good for the United States as well, in economic terms. It's that simple. Sure, Puerto Rico is not some huge new market, even with rapid growth. It's not going to compete with the Euro market, for example, but it's adding a closer connection for U.S. business in Puerto Rico, and that's certainly desirable from the point of view of those businesses that are positioned to take advantage of it.
Excellent. So another big issue has to do, obviously, with Puerto Rico's post-disaster recovery process. Obviously, in 2017, Puerto Rico experienced the worst natural disasters that it's had in a century with hurricanes Irma and Maria. And then earlier this year, we had a set of earthquakes, which impacted the island as well. But the federal government in Congress has approved tens of billions of dollars for Puerto Rico's post-disaster reconstruction. And while some of that money has started to flow, a lot of it still remains in the pipeline and will inevitably need to be spent probably over the course of the next decade. So given the expectation for all of this post-disaster reconstruction spending, do you believe that the massive attention that would be given to Puerto Rico at the national and at the international level with statehood admission could actually combine with the federal expenditures that are expected for the post-disaster reconstruction to kind of set Puerto Rico up for a period of significant economic growth?
Well, sure. I mean, look, it's not, you don't have to talk about massive things. If Puerto Rico were a state, it would have several members of Congress, 2 senators and a few Congress people. Let me tell you, Puerto Rico would not have been treated so badly. That money would not be still sitting in some account somewhere. It had representatives who were voting in the U.S. Congress, and if the people there had been voting for the president. Houston didn't get treated this badly. Florida didn't get treated this badly in hurricanes at the same time. And I mean, California's getting treated pretty badly with the fires, but that's another issue. But it's very political. And that, yes, not all that money should come at once. Puerto Rico couldn't effectively use it all at once, but it came much slower to Puerto Rico. So statehood would certainly make a difference in all these matters because of the representation in Congress and the votes for president.
Excellent.
So I would just say, Puerto Rico is $100 billion economy. And so when you are going to, when you start talking about spending in the tens of billions, even if it's coming over a decade, and you combine that with the flow of federal funds that would come with statehood, you start talking about, 10, 15% of GDP in economic stimulus sustained over many years. I mean, I think it's hard to argue that, barring some humongous external shock, obviously if the world went into a global depression, I think that would, Puerto Rico would be affected by that. But I mean, you just can't spend, you can't increase spending, nominal spending in your economy by 15% of GDP and just say that, well, nothing's going to happen. I mean, you're going to see a big increase in economic activity in the short run. I would say it would happen where, hey, maybe, Walmart would hire more cashiers and more stock people and existing businesses. And hopefully the longer run effects would be that if the environment looked like there was more consumer demand and more people with disposable income, new businesses would open, and that would, start a virtuous cycle.
So one of the issues that has come up over and over again related to Puerto Rico's economic development strategies and also its political status is the role of manufacturing within Puerto Rico's economy. In the mid-20th century, Operation Bootstrap and all of the economic growth that came out of that was really focused on a kind of industrialization by invitation, or in the case of Puerto Rico, industrialization by tax exemption strategy. And obviously that has been volatile in a lot of ways, and in a lot of ways it's created economic activity, but not necessarily supported the development of local wealth. How do you believe that the change over to statehood could potentially impact our economic development in whichever sectors where we have economic potential that has remained underdeveloped because of the fact that we've been so focused on economic development based on tax breaks?
Well, I agree with you about the importance of the tax breaks, but one must remember that in the era of Operation Bootstrap, there were some other things involved. Puerto Rico had privileged access compared to other low-income parts of the world to the U.S. market. It also had low wages, so it was part of those low-income parts of the world. Both those things have changed. That is, the privileged access is no longer there. Lots of lower income places have access to the U.S. market. So that model of the early years couldn't have lasted under these circumstances. Yet, in the eyes of policymakers in Puerto Rico, it's the same old thing. It's the same effort to use tax breaks both from the federal government and within Puerto Rico to attract manufacturing activity. Puerto Rico has no special advantages in manufacturing. There's no reason to think that manufacturing in Puerto Rico is the foundation for long-term economic growth without tremendous wasted subsidies, if you'll pardon me, from the US government. So Puerto Rico has to look elsewhere. I don't mean manufacturing should be abandoned. It has a role, but not the central role this has. Moreover, the great majority of the value added in manufacturing in Puerto Rico is profits. That it does not go to Puerto Rican people or businesses. It goes to the companies themselves, and they can use it in many ways, short of bringing it directly back to the United States. So while Mike is correct that the gross domestic product is about 100 billion, the GNP, that is what gets done in Puerto Rico, is only about 70 billion. And manufacturing has this tremendous distorting effect. While it provides about 45% of gross domestic product, it accounts for less than 10% of employment. In the United States, where manufacturing is about 14 or 15%, it also has about 10% of employment. If you looked at those figures by themselves, you think Puerto Ricans were much more productive than US workers. Well, of course, it's a distortion. It has to do with transfer pricing, where they manipulate the prices, and also they locate their patents in Puerto Rico. That greatly increases the profits, but doesn't affect employment. It's not a basis for growth. I would not suggest that agriculture and tourism can take over the economy, but they've been ignored. Here are places where Puerto Rico has some possibilities, and they've been ignored. They haven't been supported. The Dominican Republic, almost next door, has supported its tourism much more than Puerto Rico. Has had great success in that regard. Now, there's some problems there. I'm not want to ignore that, but certainly that has to change. And the jolt of becoming a state might provide the basis for that.
Excellent. Mike, you want to give some quick feedback on that before we switch over to the questions from the audience? We've got a ton of questions here.
Sounds great. I'll keep it brief. I would echo absolutely everything that Arthur just said, particularly the GNP versus GDP issue. If you look at countries like Ireland or jurisdictions like Puerto Rico, that distortion exists precisely because so many companies locate here, and most of what's profits which accrue to them are counted in GDP, but they're not necessarily or not at all shared with the local residents. And again, that's why when independence comes up, I always mention the wage issue, and because even now, finally, independence leaders or serious ones are admitting that exports would have to be a big boosting exports would have to be a big part of the economic plan, but they don't want to admit that, you know, when the exports were happening during, you know, Operation Bootstrap, again, Puerto Rico had a tremendous wage advantage, you know, vis-a-vis the United States. As Arthur pointed out, the other countries didn't have access. Now Puerto Rico has high wages relative to, you know, Mexico or even Dominican Republic, and I know that there was even some friction with some trade deal with the Dominican Republic, where, you know, Dominican wages are much lower than in Puerto Rico. And so there was, I think it was a military uniform industry. There was some limited activity here, and they wanted to allow Dominicans firms access to that market. And people said, you know, the entire, you know, that'll wipe out the Puerto Rican industry here. And they're right, because you know what, the, you know, wages are relative for a middle income country, you know, which was what Puerto Rico would be if it were independent. Wages are, you know, are pretty high. So yeah, that's all I'd like to add.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Well, we're going to get started with some questions from the audience, because we've been bombarded with a lot of great questions, and I want to make sure that we can get through as many of them as possible. We'll start out with a question from Edwin Estrada. He asks, during the past plebiscite campaigns, a subject of federal taxes has been used to instill fear so Puerto Ricans question their ability to handle statehood economically. Do any of you feel that it would be beneficial for pro-statehood interests to put together an economic plan ideas about how statehood transition would look like to the average Puerto Rican citizen, as I believe clarity in this area would help allay any economic fears on statehood?
The great majority of Puerto Ricans would not pay any federal income tax. Their incomes are too low. In the example I gave earlier of the two families, their incomes were too low to pay any federal income tax. So as a fear, it's not warranted for the great majority of people. Also, there'd have to be adjustments in the Puerto Rican tax system if it were part of the United States. But there have been some studies done, you know, at least a decade old in what I've seen, but it's quite clear it's the same.
Absolutely.
All right.
75% of Puerto Ricans would not pay a dime more in federal income tax, and most would receive large subsidies on their wages. Credits.
Right, the earned income tax credit and the
child tax credit.
Yeah, they get those. So in terms of taxes and credits, the vast majority of Puerto Ricans would come out well ahead. And if that could be made clear, it would dispense with that fear.
Excellent. And the next question is from Jose Cabrera, and this one's for Mike. Mike, do you consider that full federal funding through established programs plus increased economic activity stemming from interest in Puerto Rico would generate greater aggregate demand, or that the federal government will have to allocate sizable block of funds to jumpstart that aggregate demand?
I mean, that would be great if they could, like, aggregate, you know, again, but I'm not sure if that's constitutional. If you can give you do a stimulus package specifically for a state. I don't know if in the Admission Act you could have that. It would be great, given, you know, the decades that have gone by where Puerto Rico has not received the full equal funding on parity with what is received in the States. But obviously, again, as I echoed before, if we look at what's in the pipeline and what would come, even conservatively under statehood, you know, if we say, you know, and as Arthur pointed out correctly, I used the $100 billion number GDP because just GDP is used, you know, so much more frequently. You know, if you go back to people who took economics in the 80s, you know, they use GNP, right? Now we say GDP, but, you know, again, in Puerto Rico there is that big distortion, so we should make the distinction. And, you know, $6 billion, well, that's almost right there. That's you know, if you have a $70 billion economy, $6 billion is, you know, close to 8% of GDP. So, like, that's a humongous stimulus right there. And it's not a stimulus package in the sense that, oh, this is a one-off thing, and then, hopefully that jumpstarts the economy and we're good. No, this is every single year for multiple years, and combined with, yes, the disaster relief funding is not going to be permanent. It's going to be, spent over the next decade, as you say, as you pointed out, George. But again, when you combine those two things, I mean, that's economic rocket fuel. It's a tremendous amount of stimulus, and I feel that it would be naive to think that wouldn't have a large effect.
Excellent. And recognizing the folks that are looking at us on Facebook Live, we've got a comment from Reggie Lee Santiago Fontanes, and Reggie asks, what are your thoughts on the potential impact of statehood on labor participation? And he says, since income caps for Medicaid and food stamps would be higher.
NDITC is a big wage subsidy, right? So you have to get earned income tax credit, you have to actually work. And so it's kind of, the reason why it was passed is they said, originally where you could just receive direct cash benefits if you didn't work. Certain politicians didn't like that. I don't want to open the can of worms of whether or not that's good or bad. So they said you have to work to receive these cash. To receive a cash benefit, you actually have to be employed, because we want to encourage work. Okay, and so ETIC is a wage subsidy, and so if I'm going to join, if I'm making a decision of whether or not to join the labor force, and they say, well, you first make the calculation in your head. Yeah, I'm going to make about 20,000 if I join the labor force, and then as Arthur pointed out, no, under statehood you're going to make 28,000. Well, that's a big difference in the calculus. So I think it has to be positive for labor force participation.
I would just add that the best way to get people in the workforce is to expand the economy and create more jobs.
Absolutely.
That will pull them in. And on top of what Michael has said, I wouldn't worry too much about these better programs.
Okay, great. And we have another question from the audience, this one from Jorge Yinat. He asks, in a statehood scenario, do you think the local income tax to Hacienda should be eliminated?
Well, no, I mean, that many states have an income tax, and that should be an option for Puerto Rico as well. There are many functions of state governments, and they'd be functions of a Puerto Rican government under statehood. It might not want to do it with an income tax, although I would think that would be the best way to do it. But if it's going to do it with an income tax, it could have a much better income tax, because tied to the federal tax, it would have much more enforcement power. That it's one thing to evade taxes in Puerto Rico. It's another thing to evade taxes to the federal government. Of course, right now, since Congress won't provide any money to the IRS, you can get away with a lot in this country too. But still, tying it to the federal income tax would make it more powerful. There's no reason Puerto Rico shouldn't raise some tax revenue for state functions.
Absolutely. And I would add that, I mean, again, I'm make no secret that I'm pro statehood, but a challenging topic, when discussing statehood is, yes, there would have to be a transition to Puerto Rico's local tax system. I don't think eliminating the income tax or taking that off the table is something that should be done. But certainly, the local tax system would have to change substantially, mainly with Act 154 is basically incompatible with statehood. Some anti-statehood people like to use it as a gotcha thing, but there's many ways to raise revenue for local governments. And right now there's 50 states that have all their own tax systems. There's similarities between them certainly, but they have many ways that they can raise revenue, and Puerto Rico can follow any one of them as a model to properly fund its state government.
Excellent. And there was a previous comment that was made about special conditions that can be applied to states upon admission. And I'll note that in the process of admitting new states, Congress has in fact created certain special conditions at the moment of admission. For example, in Alaska, they have statewide ownership of subterranean resources, which are actually paid back as a general subsidy to the population of the state. So that's definitely something that's a possibility. It would just be up to Congress to figure out, what kind of special conditions would be appropriate and, how to do that. So going directly off of that, there's a question coming in from Edwin Lopez, and he asks, from an economic standpoint, as the 51st state, have the natural resources of the U.S. exclusive economic zone extending no more than 200 nautical miles for Puerto Rico ever been considered? And I'm guessing that what he's getting at is, could Puerto Rico think of, in its admission process, maximizing its potential leverage on the ownership of that exclusive economic zone?
It's a good question. I don't know anything about.
So I know that I know very little about it. I know that Justice, before she was a Supreme Court Justice, Sotomayor wrote a article about the constitutionality or the legality of such a provision in a potential admission act for Puerto Rico regarding seabed rights.
Okay. So I've got a question here from Sion Cruz, which is not necessarily an economic question, but one worth considering as well and seeing if you have a perspective on it. And Sion asks, what would happen if the no option manages to win? Do you believe that there's any economic implications to that for Puerto Rico?
Well, no can mean various different things, first of all. I think that it is possible that no could win as a combination of people who want to stick with the status quo, why I cannot figure out, and people who want independence. So it's certainly possible that could take place. Then there just have to be further. I mean, Congress is not going to let Puerto Rico in as a state if it doesn't have well over 50% of the vote. So then these other options would have to be considered. But the problem is, in my view, and I think it should, I would argue that with other people on this, the current status is illegitimate. It's illegitimate from the point of view, it's like, I don't want to say that the Puerto Ricans are in a condition of slavery, but it's like saying, well, the slaves might want to stay slaves. Well, if I were a slave, I wouldn't want to be a slave owner, and I wouldn't want to be a colonial power. I wouldn't want my country to be a colonial power, which it is at the present time with regard to Puerto Rico and a few other places. So the Puerto Ricans would have to be presented with, you got two choices. The status quo isn't one of them. Independent statehood that's my view. It's not an economic argument. And there are some arguments to independence. I mentioned earlier that the United States itself is becoming more equal. Well, at least the Independentistas party in Puerto Rico advocates a number of social programs, much more social democratic, which would be much more guided toward equality. And small island economies don't do so well by way of growth. But there are other issues here. Those issues that have to be addressed.
So, obviously, I want yes to win. I'm actually, don't believe that if no wins, that anything's going to change economically, of course. And I don't think that's the end of the statehood movement, although there's people who vehemently disagree with me. But basically, my political analysis, and again, I'm an economist, not a political scientist, so take this with a grain of salt, that regardless of preference for status, except for some independentistas, but even some of them say that even if Puerto Rico becomes independent, that people will keep U.S. citizenship. That there's an overwhelming desire among Puerto Ricans, 90% plus, who want to retain U.S. citizenship. And the fact of the matter is that as long as Puerto Ricans want to retain U.S. citizenship, there's going to be a relationship with the United States. And so I think if no wins, I don't think that independence is going to happen anytime soon. And therefore, Puerto Rico will just maintain in this status limbo of neither being fully integrated nor being a separate country. And, there'll be, the statehood movement will, keep going, and the status quo movement will keep going, and the independence movement will keep going. But I think it would be an unfortunate result, but I don't think it's the end all be all. But people should, people who support statehood, who can vote, like me, are going to go on, should vote yes.
Excellent. Well, I think we have time probably for one more question, and this is a two-part question. It comes from an audience member. His name is Dennis Freites. And Dennis asks two questions. First is, what is the estimated cost to Puerto Rico for not having been treated equally under federal laws, programs, and funding for the last 122 years? And what impact has that had on economic development? And he says that some say in Puerto Rico there's about $300 billion in federal funds that Puerto Rico's missed out on because it's in the current territory status as opposed to being treated equally as a state.
Well, I've never made any effort to estimate that figure over the 100 or more years. I have made an estimate to regarding the six programs: the Earned Income Tax Credit, the Child Tax Credit, nutritional assistance, Medicare, Medicaid, something else that's escaping me. And I got an estimate of $6.5 billion a year if those programs were fully funded for Puerto Rico. Now, it hasn't been the same all the way back. I mean, the Earned Income Tax Credit and many of those other programs did not exist more than about they started to come into effect in the post-World War II period. Nonetheless, there's a lot of money involved.
Absolutely, and assuming that you get higher growth rates, even more in terms of economic well-being. So I think had Puerto Rico been made a state, in the 1950s, you'd probably have a median income here, could well be $40, $50, $60,000 a year versus $20,000. So, we're talking, trillions of dollars.
What's the other part of the question? You said there were two.
So the other part of the question relates to Puerto Rico's debt restructuring process and PROMESA. And
big question.
Yeah. So he's asking, how can Puerto Rico get its good credit rating back, and what would statehood's impact be on the efforts to achieve Puerto Rico's debt restructuring?
So the debt restructuring has to go through before Puerto Rico can return to the markets. Now, there already is talk about Puerto Rico returning to the markets, the debt markets. I have no idea what their credit rating will be. But it won't be, default, or it'd probably be triple, double B or triple B maybe. But the main thing I would say with PROMESA is that there's been, I would just like to say that I feel that politically, it's done a lot of political damage to the island, in that right now, the main thing is that when the supervisory board puts forth what's known as a certified fiscal plan, if the legislature doesn't act, the certified fiscal plan becomes the budget. Obviously, the legislature has to act within some certain parameters, meaning mainly that they can't run deficits, which would be true with no access to credit markets. That's true whether or not the junta is there or not. So take that for what you will. But the fact that, one of the most important things that legislatures do is budgeting, and the fact that for the past 4 years, the legislature has been able to take the easy way out of just accepting the fiscal plan as the budget without making any changes. I think it really erodes kind of the political infrastructure of having the different stakeholders on the island coming together and going through that process. So, and I feel also the structural reform things, without putting the merits or demerits of them, again, you can't ram things down people's throats. They don't like it. It's anti-democratic, and it does lasting damage for trust, accountability, all those sorts of things. So that's my piece on the political side of PROMESA. On the economic side of PROMESA, the debt restructuring has been, I think, about what you would expect. Puerto Rico has been able to shed a lot of debt. It's going to be about, there's different kinds of bonds that were issued. When you average out, some bondholders of different types are going to get bigger payouts. Some are going to get less. So it's going to be about 50 cents on the dollar, averaging it all out. I think that's a unambiguous good. And I would say that, hopefully, what would add a ton of certainty to the island's economy and for the island government is for the process to finally be over and say, okay, all these deals that have been worked out have been accepted, they've been approved by the judge overseeing the case, and it's done, and now we're moving forward. So
I would just say that if I were an investor, which I am not, that I would not make loans to Puerto Rico unless there are changes in the factors that led it into this debt crisis. Because without those changes, there'll be another debt crisis down the road.
Absolutely. Although I will say that investors can be very stupid. I mean, Argentina,
but
Argentina, sure. I mean, Argentina successfully floated a 100-year bond, oversubscribed, in 2015, and by 2018 they were seeking bailouts from the IMF.
I understand. My point was that the debt crisis was a result of all sorts of structural problems, and if those structural problems tied up with the status of Puerto Rico,
absolutely,
if those structural problems are not changed, we'll be back in a mess even after the debt crisis, this particular restructuring takes place.
All right, gentlemen. Well, thank you so much for your outstanding insights and feedback. We still have a ton of questions that we haven't been able to get to from the members of the audience. So maybe that's a great incentive for us to do this event again at some other point where we can, have another opportunity to answer. It's great to bring data-driven responses to people's question about the economic implications of statehood, and to provide an opportunity for the audience to listen to two experts talk about this. So I want to thank you on behalf of the Puerto Rico Statehood Council and the PR 51st community for participating in this effort. I will be very happy to let the PR 51st community that we will be sharing with you some of the writings that Mike and Arthur have put out, so that you can dive a little bit more into the content that they've produced on these topics that will hopefully answer some of the questions that we weren't able to get to. And for everyone who's out there, we just want to thank you for tuning in tonight and participating in this event. I want to highly encourage all of you to vote in the November 3rd plebiscite. The future of Puerto Rico is in your hands. Congress is listening. This vote is getting more attention than any other electoral event of this nature that Puerto Rico's had. And there is real potential for us to make history here. And if the economic history of Hawaii and Alaska bear out in the case of Puerto Rico, where massive economic growth followed statehood, I think that that's something that would greatly benefit the island, but also greatly benefit the rest of the United States, which would much rather have a successful state that it can do interstate commerce with rather than a struggling territory that is bound up in a cycle of structural dysfunction based on unequal territory status. So with that, I encourage everyone to please follow our page on Facebook and our Twitter account. We'll be posting this video on our YouTube page, so go check that out and hit subscribe there. And thank you, everyone, and hope you have a great night.